Hello everyone, I'm Tia Renata, Rappler reporter. Earlier today, we had a chance to interview Vicente Paulo Yu III, who is the negotiator here at COP26 for the G77 plus China group. So it's the biggest negotiating group here at COP26. It represents 134 developing countries and a Pinoy, a Filipino, Vice U, Vicente Paulo Yu III, is the negotiator for this big group. So watch the footage of our interview here. And we hope that you learn a lot from the interview. So, Vice, we are currently at the tail end of the UN summit of COP26, and there has been a lot of talk about what the cover decision is firming up to be like. And obviously, we're all wondering how this will impact the Philippines. But before we get to that substantive part of the interview, so a little bit muna about your experience here at the COP. What are you feeling now? Are you tired? I mean, what's your mood?
Well, the mood is, I think, parang combination of optimistic and pessimistic. Um, I'm optimistic because at least in some of the negotiating areas that I have been handling for the G77 in China, we have seen some progress. But also pessimistic because some of the main issues that we have been raising as developing countries in these negotiations have not seen as much progress as we wished. So, if you want, I can give some examples.
Yes, please. Can you give examples?
So, for example, the areas where we have not seen much progress and where we need, I think, as developing countries, more progress is on the issues of, for example, financing, right? So one of the things that we have been raising as G77, and that includes, of course, the Philippines, is that if the rest of the world needs us to undertake more ambitious climate action, then we as developing countries need more financing, we need more technology transfer, and we need more capacity building. Yan yung tinatawag namin na means of implementation. And the link to that, the link of that to the other areas of the negotiations, which is mitigation, yung pagbaba ng greenhouse gas emissions, at saka adaptation, yung pag-build ng resilience, kumbaga, sa effects of climate change, are such that for developing countries, more mitigation actions for us would require more means of implementation being provided. Same way as adaptation. And yung position ng developing countries, actually over the past 25 years, actually, has been that these are two sides of the same coin. Hindi mo sila pwede ihiwalay. So if we need to do greater levels of emission reductions, we need to have greater levels of support coming from developed countries. So ito yung tinatawag na grand bargain that was struck in 1992 when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. It's called Common but Differentiated Responsibility and Respective Capabilities, which springs from yung recognition na the reason why we are in this climate crisis now is because when the developed countries were developing, over the past 250 years, yung mode of development that they undertook resulted in a huge increase of greenhouse gas emissions, because they cut down their forests, they started pumping out oil, they started using coal in their factories, in the 18th and 19th centuries and the early 20th century. And in addition to that, they also went to our countries, right? They colonized our countries and they took our resources to fuel their own development. And that led to this situation where yung mga mayayamang bansa ngayon effectively yumaman dahil pinulute nila yung mundo. Whereas yung mga poor countries, like, the developing countries like the Philippines, like Guinea or Nigeria or El Salvador, remained underdeveloped because the resources were not made available to us. And so that is what the G77 has long been trying to change through these negotiations by saying to developed countries, now look, when you signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, when you agreed to the Kyoto Protocol, when you agreed to the Paris Agreement in 2015, you agreed to that package deal. Now, you agreed that you would provide more money, you would provide more technology, you would provide more support to developing countries so that developing countries do not need to follow the same development mistakes as far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned as the developed countries did. Because we ourselves want to embark on a more sustainable pathway. We do not want to make our economies dependent on, for example, fossil fuels forever. We want to be able to make sure that we can, for example, in the Philippines, rely on our hydro, rely on renewables. Maybe we can even develop ocean energy technology. But for that, you need resources, diba? You need science, you need technology, you need financing for us to be able to invest in those things. So yun yung pinag-usapan ngayon dito.
So when you say slow progress, we've been hearing of this $100 billion a year pledge from developed
Yeah.
countries na ngayon it's been delayed to 2023. So
Yeah.
what are the sticky points that have led to this delay in the climate finance talks? What exactly were the conflicts?
The conflicts are that the developed countries simply do not want to stump up and increase the money. A bit of history on that pledge. That pledge that came from 2009 is not based on any data. It's not based on any science. It was just a number that was plucked from up in the air and then handed down in Copenhagen and said, this is what developed countries are ready to do, right? And for the developing countries, what we have been saying is, if you're serious about climate finance, then we have to talk about matching what you said, what we need in terms of financing requirements for our, for example, nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement with what you as developed countries have to provide. Because under the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement, they have obligations, treaty obligations, to provide financing to developing countries. So hindi pwedeng just pull a number out of the air and then say, and then we as developing countries accept it. No, that's not the deal. The deal is we have our needs, we identify those needs, and we have identified those needs, and then we discuss how far and to what extent would you as developed countries be able to provide the resources to help us meet those needs para ma-supplement yung national resources natin. Diba? So, so that's one of the major sticky points dito, climate finance, and how to move forward beyond the $100 billion political goal that was set out by the developed countries. And I think what we should also not forget is that back in 2009, they said they would meet that $100 billion goal in 2020.
Yeah.
They did not. And they moved the goalpost and said, well, baka ma-meet namin in 2023. And what we're saying to them is, well, that's not sufficient. You promised, you should have lived up to that promise. And if you did not live up to that promise in 2020, then at least come by the end of this COP and pledge that by next year, meron na kayong ma-fulfill ninyo yan, and then all the way up to 2025. And then we discuss again, starting now, ano yung kanilang commitments after 2025, which should be higher than the $100 billion.
I read the draft decision that was put out, I think yesterday
Yeah.
night, and it said there na they do recognize naman the need to scale up finance, and I think I even read a number like they want to double the finance needed. So given that this is in the draft decision,
The finance provided
yeah,
or the finance needed?
I think the finance provided should be
Okay.
doubled. So
Yeah.
given these developments, how optimistic are
Yeah.
you that what can we expect from the end of the COP in terms
Yeah.
of climate finance?
Honestly, right now everything is up in the air. I don't see, because over the past week and a half of this COP, we have seen developed countries essentially stonewalling on making concrete increased announcements in terms of climate finance as a collective. We have also seen them making it difficult to progress with discussions on what would be their finance goal after 2025. Um, Whereas us as yung developing country group, the G77 and China, has been one in saying no, we need to have to see clear and concrete numbers, number one. And second, we need to have a clear and concrete work plan in terms of how we negotiate what that new goal will be. Um, and so far, both of those things have been difficult to arrive at. So I really don't know. I mean, we still have the way that this conference is run. We're still Wednesday now, right?
Yes.
I think Wednesday.
Yes,
So
November 10.
we're supposed to end on Friday, but I have not attended a COP since I started attending COPs in 2007, where we have actually finished on time. So I expect this to run at least maybe into Saturday. The worst was Madrid because it ran over into Sunday. So I don't know. So climate finance is a sticky issue. Adaptation is also another sticky issue. Hopefully there we'll see some progress. And then the other issues that I think we have seen progress. So it's not all doom and gloom,
Okay.
right? So there are some other issues that we have seen progress in, and that is, for example, on the issue of loss and damage, right? So very important yan sa atin sa Pilipinas because we get hit by super typhoons at least 4 times a year.
Sorry, before loss and damage, just more on climate finance. What is it that the G77 bloc wants in terms of a specific figure?
Specific
finance,
figure, yeah. Okay, that's a good question. Um, we have been saying so some of our groups, for example, the African group, has been saying we need at least $1.8 trillion a year. And as a group, the G77 has been saying when we talk about what this new collective goal on finance should be and what developed countries should do in terms of scaling up climate financing, we need to be scientific about it. Hindi hocus pocus come from above, from their own ideas of how much they think we need. It has to come from how much we think we need, because we are the ones who are going to be doing the actions on the ground, right, as developing countries. So I think a couple of months ago, or was it last month, I can't remember, the Standing Committee on Finance, which is this body in the UNFCCC that is supposed to assess the state of climate financing flows and assess what the needs are, came out with a report. Shorthand report is the NDR. It's called the Needs Determination Report. And essentially what they did, the authors of that report, was they looked at all of the developing country NDCs. They looked at how much developing countries said they would need to implement their NDC, and they added it all up, right? And what essentially happened then was when they added it all up, the total sort of like financing package that developing countries said they needed was somewhere in the order of 5.8 or 5.9 trillion dollars between now to 2030, right? So over 10 years basically. So if you do round figures, for example, you say, okay, if developing countries they need something like 600 trillion dollars, tama ba? Yes,
Yeah.
$6 trillion. I mean, $6 trillion over 10 years. That's roughly about 600 billion a year. Diba? Compare that to the $100 billion pledge.
So the developed countries don't like that.
They don't like that because they don't want to be pegged to a baseline.
So they want to stick to the $100 billion.
well, they at the minimum that is what they should do, and I think at the minimum that is maybe that might even be the maximum that they want. But I think the bottom line of it is that developed countries um, do not want to be committed to specific numbers that they have to provide.
Okay.
That is negotiated.
But the 100 billion is a specific number.
It's a specific number that they provided.
Ah.
It was not negotiated with developing countries.
Mm.
Okay, so what I'm saying is, I think ang gusto ng mga developed countries ngayon is they want to be able to set the goal themselves. And second, yung bagong goal after 2025. And second, I think they want to be able to include as part of that collective goal, not just them, but also developing countries. So we should also be contributing towards that global climate finance goal to provide to each other, which for the G77 is not correct legally and ethically. It's not correct legally because the collective finance goal is the expression of Article 4.3 and 4.4 and 4.5 of the Convention in terms of financial needs, which is also reflected in Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. So developing countries see this new collective goal as a continuation of developed countries' collective goal, not all of us universally. Because if you say all of us universally, then it's as if saying that, okay, you poor countries, you fund your own selves, right? And yung national budget natin, for example, then gets to be part of that collective goal, right?
Where does China stand in that pledge?
China is in developing country group. Yeah, so as far as their positioning is concerned, they're along the same lines as us. They do not see themselves as being subject to the obligations of developed countries because they do not see themselves as a developed country. They know that they will not be. I think as far as they're concerned, they're not going to access any financial support. I think, although I should not actually be. I think that's not correct. I think they do recognize that they are still a developing country. And so their position here has been completely aligned with the rest of the developing countries on the climate finance issue.
All right. You mentioned loss and damage as one of the positive developments here.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, of course. Yung loss and damage is important for us as the Philippines, for example, as well as other developing countries, largely because of the impacts that we're now experiencing. Diba? Umaakyat, it's increasing. So one of the things that we as developing countries raised when we entered COP26 and it started was we wanted to see a greater level of institutionalization of loss and damage in the convention and Paris Agreement regime. So coming from yung tinatawag namin na Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage that was established in 2013, and the Philippines was actually instrumental in that.
That was
then.
Yolanda, right? 2013.
Yeah, Yolanda. So si Yeb was, was the, we had a big impact in how that was shaped. Yeah, so in Madrid in 2019, developing countries came out with the idea that kulang pa yung na-establish na mechanism in 2013 and then yung Article 8 in 2015. We needed more. Kasi ang habol ng developing countries was, we have loss and damage. So we need technical assistance and we need financial assistance for us to be able to address those impacts. And so we pushed to have a network of the organizations that could provide technical assistance and finance to be more coordinated. So it was established in Madrid because we called it the Santiago Network on loss and damage. Pero wala siyang what yung tinatawag namin dito, operational modalities. Yung kumbaga operating manual
Yeah.
at hindi din na-define in Madrid who is going to run that network. So it was just like bare shell pa lang siya. So we came into Madrid saying we need to have those. We need to have that operating manual at kailangan din natin ma-identify who's going to run that network. Pero yung developed countries said, no, ayaw namin. We okay na yung Madrid. And the reason for that, I think, is because gusto nila ng flexibility. They want to be able to do things as they have been doing things in terms of providing that kind of assistance. So for developing countries, we felt it was really important that we come out of COP26 with a clear set of what we call the functions of the Santiago network, yung meron tayong common understanding of this is what we want that network to do. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then sabi namin at saka hindi basta-basta yung pagpili ng whoever is going to run it. Right? Whoever is going to do the coordinating thing. Kailangan pag-usapan niya ng members ng parties to the Paris Agreement and the Convention para klaro sa atin na it will not be just any organization from any developed country that will run it. It has to be scientific, meron kang criteria, meron kang approach. And we knew that we would not be able to get both things at the same time. So we entered into these negotiations saying we want to get a clear set of functions, and then we want to have an agreement that over the course of next year, we will negotiate on how we set up that institutional architecture. Okay, so yung developed countries were saying in the beginning last week na hindi, gusto namin pag-usapan both at the same time next year. Okay, sabi namin na hindi pwede kasi for us as developing countries, we said form follows function. Diba? Parang i-decide mo muna na gusto mong pumunta from Quezon City to Montalban, and then pag-isipan mo kung magbibisikleta ka ba, magji-jeep ka ba, magbubus ka ba, or lalakad ka lang. Diba? So yung bus, tricycle, or jeep is the institutional architecture. Yung gusto mong pumunta from Quezon City to Montalban is yung functions that you want to do, right? Ang gusto nila sabayin. Anyway, they were I think to give credit where credit is due, they were flexible, so we managed to get the functions.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Diba? So we got the functions, and then we also got the process that says we are gonna do this negotiations on whether it's a bicycle or a tricycle or whatever next year in terms of the institutional architecture. But that's not the story of loss and damage here. This COP does not stop there kasi meron kaming pinupush na gusto namin na mapag-usapan yung loss and damage finance as part of the both overall climate financing package and as part of what we were negotiating loss and damage. Kasi ang sinasabi namin, when we look at how the world is changing, right? We are now starting to realize that financing for mitigation and financing for adaptation are no longer sufficient. Over the course of time, we are going to see more and more impacts happening na hindi na makaya pondohan or suportahan simply through adaptation financing. So we need that kind of loss and damage financing. And so what we wanted to do was to make sure that at least at this COP, merong clear recognition na yes, kailangan yan. Kahit wala pang numbers, okay lang walang numbers. Kasi we don't have time to negotiate those numbers here. Pero ang nilalagay namin as G77 in China is to say that discussion is important, and that discussion needs to be part of this overall discussion on climate financing. So hopefully, as the discussion on what to do and how much to put in after 2025 rolls around continues, it will become a discussion where you talk about mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage financing. So kumbaga maging triumvirate na sila. And what we're saying is hindi magkapareha yung adaptation and loss and damage.
Mhm.
So, kung anumang pera for loss and damage must be new and additional. Hindi siya dapat kunin from adaptation. At hindi din siya dapat kunin from mitigation support.
Mhm.
Kasi, if you take out money from mitigation, then we will not do as much emission reductions. If you take out money from adaptation, we won't do as much. So it has to be like lahat umi-increase para developing countries will then have access to more resources for us to actually do more.
Mm.
But I mean, that's what we all want to do. We all want to be able to do more.
For the benefit of viewers, when you say developed countries, what are you referring to? Which nation?
Developed countries are, yung mga mayayamang bansa. So this would be the US, the European Union, Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand.
Do they also form a bloc? Like
Yes. The EU, so yung mga European countries, work together under the European Union. So they negotiate as one and they speak as one. So you will not hear here in the negotiation say Germany speaking as Germany or France speaking as France. They all subsume their voices under the European Union. The US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Iceland, Norway, yung mga hindi members ng European Union na mayayamang bansa, have what they call it the umbrella group. Okay, so we call it in our slang dito, we call it UG. Okay, sa Pilipinas yung UG may ibang connotation, di ba? But here, UG stands for the US and all that. So they sometimes negotiate together. Most often they speak individually, but they coordinate their positions. So sometimes what happens is, for example, I would speak as G77 in China on a particular issue. So I speak on behalf of 134 countries. And then my colleagues from the African group would speak for the African group representing 54 countries, or yung ILAC, yung Latin American group would be speaking for, I think, 7 sila, or small island states speaking for like several dozen. But then across the table, you have the US speaking as itself, Canada is speaking as itself. So sometimes, I feel na meron ding inequality dyan kasi I'm speaking on behalf of 6 billion people, for example, and Canada speaks on behalf of 20 million, or Switzerland speaks on behalf of 8 million, but their voice carries the same weight as my or my colleague's voice representing 6 billion people. So parang so there is that kind of like inequality in terms of the voices. Um, kung voting lang yung conference na to, then panalo palagi kami. We just vote and vote and vote, outvote you all the time. But that's not how this conference is done. It's always by consensus. So you all have to get everybody to agree. So,
where do the oil producing countries fit in? Are they also developed? Do they also take the same stance on
no,
damage?
the oil producing developing countries are in the G77 in China. Most of them are, of course, in the Arab group because of the Gulf and all that. But they are also scattered in different groups, right? Like, for example, you have this group called the Like-Minded Developing Countries Group. The Philippines used to be part of it, and then it left. But in that Like-Minded Developing Countries Group, you have some but not all of the oil-producing Gulf countries. And then in the Arab group, of course, you have all of them because they're all, from the Arabian Peninsula. So and they carry when we have a G77 position, then the assumption is they also repeat those positions as part of their own positioning. Although, of course, they usually speak as the Arab group. And in that case, they have specific issues that are very important to them, which might not be as important to other countries, right? Like, for example, for them, it's very important that there is a fair treatment of the economic and social consequences of the impacts of response measures. Yun yung long term. Yun yung jargon. But ibig sabihin lang yan is, sinasabi nila, we must all recognize na kumbaga single commodity economy sila. Right? Now kung lahat tayo sasabihin na wala ng oil, anong mangyayari sa economy nila? And for the Philippines, anong mangyayari sa migrant workers natin? Doon, we have how many there? 4 million? I don't know how many millions we have working in the Gulf, right? If the economies crash, look at what happened with Libya and Lebanon. We had to send, we had to send evacuation flights and bring them all home, right? So that a lot of these things have interlinkages with each other. So it's not simply an issue of to address climate change, let's all reduce emissions because we all have different circumstances, right? And what I've always been saying is, yes, it's important to reduce or avoid emissions, but at the same time, there should be some countries who should do more than others on that front, while others do more on adaptation rather than mitigation at their climate action. And that's the case in the Philippines, right? Um, for example, and this is when I give lectures on this issue, I always make give an example for in terms of a visual imagery. So, for example, in the U.S., their average, their per capita emissions of carbon dioxide equivalent, so greenhouse gases, right? Say, I think the latest figure I saw was like 2018. So their average per capita emissions somewhere around 15 tons per capita, metric tons. 1 metric ton is 1,000 kilos. Diba? So what is 1,000 kilos? Na-visualize mo ba? 1,000 kilos is 1 Kia Pride na kotse. Okay, so imagine an average American or an individual American per capita in the US emits 15 Kia Prides na nakahilera down the road. That's how much they emit. How much does the Philippines emit per capita? We emit 1.98 tons per person per year. So dalawang Kia Pride lang tayo. Diba? So if you were to ask everybody, please reduce emissions, maybe unfair yan. Kasi kung sabihin mo, okay, everybody reduce emissions from where you are to 50%, then what essentially you're saying is, okay, Americans, you can still emit 7 more Kia Prides, pero tayo isa na lang. Diba? And our problem, and ang problem not only for us, but for most other developing countries is that a reason why most of us have low per capita emissions is because many of our economies are either agriculture dependent or subsistence or very low productivity, or because many of our countries in developing countries do not have much in terms of energy access. And so that's why you have low per capita emissions. Whereas in their case, they have more energy than they can maybe deal with, right?
So when you say you talk about the developments, the loss and damage, can you already say as early as now that it's a win for developing countries?
In some ways, yes, I would say, and that's what we were flagging kanina in the stock take. The chair of the G77 said, yes, we have seen significant progress, at least for us as a group, because we saw we got what we thought we should get out of COP26, at least on that technical issue of loss and damage. And we know there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, but we were able to progress. So I think that's one of the few bright lights so far of the COP. But maybe for the viewers, what we also have to understand is that the COP here, what we're trying to do here as negotiators, is only a small part of the show. What we're trying to do here is set in place, say, international rules or things that we would agree to as governments to act on. But if you have noticed what the UK presidency is doing, it is doing many other things that is outside of our negotiating context. So it's been pushing other countries to make pledges on the methane agreement, on maybe there are some countries calling for a phasing out of oil and gas or whatever. There has been this like private sector initiatives on climate finance. All of those are things that we are not dealing with, but all of those are also things that the COP president will claim was done because of COP26. So in effect, meron kang two levels of outcomes from here. One is a negotiated outcome, which might not be that big, and the other one is an external outcome, which is not dependent on what we do at all. And the question is, ano bang value ng outcomes na nasa labas, right? How can you hold whoever made those pledges accountable in a multilateral context, right?
As a as a negotiator from a developing country and having been a negotiator for so many years, what do you feel that the climate finance issue is still so far from becoming reality?
Hmm. Um, Now, it has always been a major sticking point, largely because developed countries, I feel, are very hesitant to commit funding to, and this is my personal view, right? I think they're very hesitant to commit funding to potentially countries that might become eventually competitors, like India, China, and even us in Southeast Asia. We are um, among the developing countries. The countries in Southeast Asia are the ones who are likely to become major um, trading competitors for many of the developed countries because we have a relatively decent level of industrialization already. Um, Developed countries are willing to provide money, I think, so long as it's only for the least developed countries and the small island states, right? Uh, but then my analysis of that is if you corral that climate finance money only for the LDCs and the least and the small island states, that leaves you with only something like providing climate finance only to something like maybe maybe 500, 600 million people out of 6 billion people in developing countries. Okay. And what people often forget is that most of the world's poor, those who live below $2.50 a day, actually live in countries like India, like Pakistan, like us. I think what's our poverty rate now? 15%, maybe 20%. Indonesia, countries like in Central America, in Brazil, in Africa, na hindi least developed country. So if you coral climate finance only for LDCs and small island developing countries, some of whom actually are richer than the Philippines in terms of per capita, then you're essentially saying na konti lang yung gusto naming ibigay na pera, di ba? Rather than really matching it to what the needs are of the other developing countries. So I think that's one of it. And second, of course, is I think in some ways, developed countries tend to think that middle income developing countries like ours, we have the resources, right? Or kahit paano, we have the capability to do that. And maybe, yes, we do. Um, because chances are there's a lot of wastage going on, right? It's not just in the Philippines, but also in many of the developing countries. You have inefficiencies in government. You might have corruption and all that kind of thing. So definitely, there's a lot of things that we should do at home as well to improve the way that we use our own resources. Um,
How would you assess the Philippine delegation's participation in the negotiations and the stances they've taken
Yeah.
so far?
here at COP26. Honestly, I have not been tracking them. I mean, in my negotiating issue, which was on loss and damage, I've had the benefit of having the Philippines participate actively through Yusek Ventabella of the DOE, and he has been quite articulate. So I think, and through his participation in at least in the negotiating issue that I handle, um, he has been able to, for example, articulate the need that when you talk about loss and damage technical assistance, it has to be demand driven, right? So meaning it has to come from us. We have to be the ones to tell the donors, ito yung kailangan namin. It shouldn't be the donors saying us, ito yung kailangan ninyo. But it doesn't make sense kung sila. So, so some of the, a lot of that thinking that articulated on behalf of the Philippines on the negotiating floor and internally within our coordination group within the G77 has also made its way into the text. So I think that has been positive. Um, but for the other parts of the issues, for the other issues here at this COP, I really cannot say because I have not been sort of like following the other issues as, I guess, in depth as what I have done for the issues I was covering.
Okay. The last part of interview, Vice, is about your personal experience as a negotiator because you're a lawyer from the Philippines and you're representing 134 countries and like you said, that's 6 billion people.
Yeah.
How do you feel that this responsibility is upon your shoulders?
No, for me, it's always been a privilege, to speak on behalf of developing countries. I of course, galing ako sa Pilipinas, right? And my early professional life was spent working with indigenous communities. I put myself through law school, working in an NGO that was founded by Justice Marvick Leonen and Tony Lavinia, and some other colleagues. And that has really shaped sort of like yung approach ko towards addressing how do we link about what how should we understand environmental issues. And it's not simply understanding environmental issues for environment's sake, but because environmental issues affect people's lives. And because they affect people's lives, you really have to think about environment, for example, and climate and biodiversity loss from the perspective of how can this help create a better life for communities, for vulnerable sectors, right? And stuff like that has been my guiding light. I mean, I'm privileged, like many of us who come from middle class families back home, had the benefit of a good education, so and that's and maybe through this kind of work, even if I'm no longer on the ground in the Philippines, maybe this is one of the ways that I feel that I'm able to pay back, to and pay forward, at least that um, feeling of moral obligation to at least try to help make this world a better place, for us and for our children and and, and those who are less advantaged than what we were or how I was, at least. So for me, negotiating on behalf of the group is a privilege, um, and I find particularly fulfilling the ability to work together with a brilliant and dedicated team of colleagues from all over the world. And it's so much fun actually for me, and that's one of the things I should also mention. It's not um, tawag din sa Pilipinas GND. Okay, so we're not grim and determined. We are determined, yes, but grim sometimes when we need to. But I think a big part of the fulfillment that many of us have in this process is the ability to work with colleagues, from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, different cultures. But in the end, because of that work, you realize that we have a common humanity. you know, and that common humanity calls on us to work together for a better future for the humans who are coming in the future.
Last question, Vice. Negotiations for the average person can seem a bit abstract and far from reality. Like we don't understand that it's bewildering actually that it's all about words,
Yeah.
right? Bracketed
Yeah.
text, and a lot of people just can't relate to these climate
Mm-hmm.
summits.
Yeah.
As a negotiator, how would you explain the importance of negotiations to the lives of every single person, even if
Yeah.
it's so far from the reality?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a super excellent question, and one that I've always struggled with. Especially like answering my two daughters. Papa, why are you away for like 3 weeks at a time? Attending this. What do you actually get? What how does that impact us? And I think what we have to understand is those of us trying to negotiate international treaties or international rules do so because we know that ultimately this will have an impact in terms of our daily lives down the road. So, for example, if we were to agree here at this COP that adaptation is a priority and therefore adaptation financing and loss and damage as a priority, and therefore loss and damage financing should be made available to all of us. In terms of actual impact, what that means is um, we would maybe then provide the global community would then provide more funding into the adaptation fund, and then if there's a loss and damage fund, we would have that. And that means that when typhoons hit us, and for example, Malabon goes under even more, right, or Navotas, then there's a bigger really go to some of these funds and say we actually need X tens of millions of dollars to address this impact. And if that project, if that funding is available, then that actually helps relieve part of the pressure on the national budget, right? And if and that national budget can then be used maybe to provide more schools or more maybe public transport or whatever. So it's sort of like that kind of thing. The other possible impact is, for example, on mitigation, right? Emission reductions. If, for example, the COP or future COPs result in an agreement that yes, we all have to reduce by X% within a certain number of years. And that has to be translated into your national policies. What that means is that after that agreement was taken, the Philippines would have to go back and think about okay, how do we change our energy plan, our medium term energy development plan? Do we need to change our medium term Philippine development plan? Do we need to change the way that we plan our urban communities? If emission reductions is a target, do we need to, for example, ban jeepneys? Okay, if you have to do that, because in the Philippines, remember, a big part of the emissions come from public transport, from transportation, from vehicles. So, do we need to ban cars? Do we need to ban jeepneys? If we ban jeepneys, because they are a major source of employment in urban areas, saan mo ilalagay yung mga jeepney drivers? So things that we do here might be abstract, but if you do them wrongly, they could actually create adverse impacts downstream at a national level, which will then affect the daily lives of the people. Another example is, stringent emission reductions targets might then mean that um, yung ma-accelerate yung phase out ng coal-fired power plants natin, right? If and we do actually need to close down those coal-fired power plants and maybe rely on more renewable energy. But the question is, how fast do we need to go, or how fast should we go? Because at the same time, you want to make sure that we have sufficient electricity to run the factories, for the schools, for the hospitals, and all that, right? So if you shut down the power plants that provide energy now in and then wait for several years before new sources, renewable sources of energy come online, then we might be facing a certain number of years where, parang 1990s, brown out and brown out, 6 hours a day, whatever. And that has a crippling effect on the economy. So all of those things have to be carefully thought about because what happens at the international level will have an impact on us eventually.
So we just spoke with Vice Yu, who is the negotiator for the G77 plus China bloc here in COP26. He has a few more days of negotiations and talks, wrangling with techs to come up with a final decision by parties to the UNFCCC here in COP26. So Rappler will continue to be monitoring the situation, giving you reports, updates on what's happening here at the UN Climate Summit. Stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching Rappler Talk. Again, I'm Pierre Nada. See you next time.